The rain had been falling since morning, turning the streets into tiny rivers that shimmered under the dull light of passing cars. Inside a small cafe on the corner, a woman sat behind the counter wiping down tables even though only a few customers had come in all day. Her hands were tired and her apron was stained with coffee and milk. She didn't complain, though. She rarely did. The woman's name was Laura, and for her this wasn't just a job, it was survival. Every morning Laura woke up before sunrise. She'd quietly make breakfast for her little boy, pack his lunch and walk him to school before heading to the cafe. Life hadn't been kind to her. She used to dream of becoming a musician. There was a time when her fingers danced on piano keys, when melodies filled her world with hope. But dreams don't pay bills, and since her husband left years ago, hope was something she'd learned to carry quietly. Laura lived in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and a piano that hadn't been tuned in years. It sat by the window, covered in dust and memories. Her son, a cheerful boy of 7, often asked her to play, and sometimes when the world felt too heavy, she did. Those were the moments that reminded her who she once was, someone who believed that music could heal. That afternoon at the cafe, the owner came out from the kitchen and told her something unexpected. One of the volunteers from a nearby children's therapy center had called in sick. They needed someone to fill in for a few hours to help watch the kids. "You play piano, right?" the owner asked. "They've got one over there. Maybe you could play a little to calm them down." Laura hesitated. It had been so long since she'd played in front of anyone other than her son. "I don't know if I'm good enough anymore," she said softly, but the owner smiled. "Those kids won't care about perfect. They just need something kind." Laura looked down at her worn hands and thought about the little extra money she could earn. Every bit mattered, so she nodded and said she'd go after her shift. When she arrived at the therapy center later that evening, the sun had already started to fade. The building smelled faintly of crayons and disinfectant. Laughter and crying echoed faintly through the halls. A staff member welcomed her warmly and guided her to a small room where several children sat in a circle. Some played quietly, others stared blankly at the walls. In the corner stood an old upright piano, scratched and slightly out of tune. Seeing it made something stir inside her. It reminded her of the one she'd played as a child, the same one that made her believe music could speak when words could not. As she took a seat on the small bench, she noticed a little girl sitting by herself near the window. Her head was down, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She didn't look up, not even when other children came over to play nearby. The staff whispered that the girl had been through something painful. She hadn't spoken in weeks. Laura didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She had seen that kind of silence before, the kind that comes when the world feels too loud, too heavy. So she turned back to the piano. The keys were cold under her fingers. For a moment, she simply sat there, uncertain of what to play. Then, almost instinctively, she began to play a soft tune she used to hum to her son at bedtime. A lullaby that carried both sadness and peace. The sound filled the room gently, wrapping around the children like a warm blanket. The chatter grew quiet. The staff paused by the door. Even the air seemed to still. The melody was simple, but there was something in the way she played, something honest. The little girl by the window lifted her head. Her eyes, red from crying, followed the movement of Laura's hands. Slowly, she shifted closer. Laura noticed her but didn't stop. She kept playing, letting each note fall like a whisper of comfort. After a few minutes, the girl stood beside the piano. She reached out and touched one of the keys, pressing it timidly. The sound startled her at first, but then a small, almost invisible smile flickered on her face. Laura smiled gently and nodded, encouraging her to press another key. Together they began to play, a slow, unsteady rhythm that somehow fit perfectly with the melody. It wasn't planned, it wasn't polished, but it was beautiful. One of the staff members quietly took a step back, holding back tears. It had been so long since they'd seen the child respond to anything. When the song came to an end, Laura turned slightly and whispered, "That was lovely." The girl looked at her for a long moment, then whispered back, "Can you play it again?" It was the first thing she had said in weeks. The room went completely silent, and a few of the staff exchanged stunned looks. Laura didn't know the full story, but she could feel the weight of that moment. She smiled again and nodded. "As many times as you like." She played the tune again, and the girl leaned against the side of the piano, her eyes soft, her breathing steady. The notes drifted down the hall, reaching the ears of someone standing just outside. Laura didn't notice him. She was too focused on the child beside her, but at the doorway stood a tall man in a dark coat holding a briefcase. His expression was one of quiet disbelief. He had come to the center earlier than expected to meet with the director about his daughter's condition. But instead he found this scene, the little girl who hadn't spoken in weeks, now whispering along to a melody played by a stranger. He didn't step in right away. Something held him there, watching. The woman at the piano had a tired look in her eyes, but her smile was gentle. The way she looked at his daughter was not out of pity, but out of understanding. The man felt his throat tighten. He had tried everything, therapy, doctors, even expensive treatments, but nothing had reached his little girl. Now this woman with worn clothes and kind eyes had managed to do it with a few simple notes. After the children were taken back to their rooms, Laura stayed behind to help clean up. She didn't notice the man approach until she turned around and nearly bumped into him. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quickly, stepping back. "It's all right," he said quietly. His voice carried both warmth and exhaustion. "That song you played? What was it?" She smiled shyly. "Just something I made up for my son. It helps him sleep when he's scared." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "It helped her," he said softly. Laura didn't fully understand, but she could tell he was speaking from the heart. "I'm glad," she replied simply. He wanted to say more, but before he could, one of the staff called him away. She assumed he was another parent, maybe one of the volunteers. She had no idea who he really was or how much that moment had meant to him. As she packed her bag and got ready to leave, Laura looked back at the piano one more time. For the first time in years, she felt a small spark of peace. Maybe music still had a place in her life after all. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night air was cool and the streetlights glowed softly. She pulled her thin coat tighter and began the long walk home. Her shoes were soaked, her back ached, but there was something new in her heart, a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. When she reached her apartment, her son was already half asleep on the couch. She kissed his forehead, whispered goodnight, and sat by the window staring out at the city lights. In her mind, she could still hear the sound of that little girl's voice asking her to play again. It was small, fragile, but full of life. She didn't know it yet. But that moment, the song, the girl, and the quiet man watching from the doorway, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. As the wind brushed against the window pane, Laura placed her fingers on the dusty keys of her old piano. She began to play that same lullaby again, this time for herself. And though she didn't have much in that moment, she felt rich in the only way that truly mattered, through love, compassion, and the power of a song that could touch a broken soul. The sound filled the small apartment, soft and trembling like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, letting the melody carry her away. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving, she was living, one note at a time. The next morning began like any other for Laura. The alarm buzzed softly beside her bed and she woke before the sun had fully risen. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of early traffic outside. Her son was still asleep, his small hands clutching his blanket tightly. She smiled as she looked at him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He was the reason she kept going, no matter how tired or uncertain life became. She moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast with whatever was left in the pantry. Some bread, a bit of jam, and instant coffee for herself. There wasn't much, but she made it work. As she buttered the bread, her mind wandered back to the night before. The sound of the old piano, the soft voice of the little girl, and the warmth that had filled the room. They all played in her memory like a gentle song. Something about that moment had stayed with her. It wasn't just the music. It was the way the child had looked at her, as if she had finally been seen, finally understood. Laura had no idea that someone else had been watching that same moment with equal wonder. Later that morning, at the other end of the city, the man in the dark coat sat at his office desk, still thinking about what he had witnessed. His world was one of meetings, reports, and endless responsibility. People spoke to him in polished tones, afraid to say the wrong thing. But nothing in his corporate life had prepared him for what he saw at that therapy center. His daughter, who hadn't smiled or spoken for weeks, had reached out because of a stranger's music. He stared out the window of his office tower, lost in thought. The city stretched endlessly below him. Cars moving like ants, people hurrying without looking up. All his success, his money, his influence had failed to bring his child back from her silence. And yet, that woman had done it with a simple tune. Back in her small apartment, Laura cleaned up after breakfast and prepared for another long day at the cafe. Her son hugged her tightly before she left for work, whispering, "Don't forget to play tonight." She promised she would. At the cafe, things were busy as usual. The sound of cups clinking, coffee machines hissing, and chatter filled the air. Laura moved quickly between tables, greeting customers with her soft smile. Most people didn't notice her much, but that didn't bother her. She wasn't there to be noticed. She was there to earn enough to keep her little family going. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back to that small girl. She couldn't stop wondering how she was doing. Was she still smiling? Did she ask for another song? That simple moment had touched her deeply, more than she could explain. That afternoon, as Laura wiped down the counter, her phone buzzed with a message from the therapy center. They thanked her for coming the previous evening and asked if she could return for a few more sessions to help with the children's music activities. For a moment, Laura froze. She had never expected that. She wasn't a music therapist, just a cafe worker who happened to know how to play. Still, something in her heart said yes before her mind could overthink it. She typed back a quick reply saying she would be happy to help. That evening, when she arrived at the center, the air felt lighter. She walked into the familiar room and the children greeted her with excitement. The piano stood in the same corner, waiting. The little girl from before was already there, sitting quietly with a small stuffed animal in her lap. When their eyes met, the girl's face brightened a little. She didn't say much, but her shy wave said everything. Laura smiled warmly and sat down at the piano again. "Shall we play?" she asked softly. The girl nodded. This time, Laura chose a livelier melody, something cheerful and full of life. The children clapped along, giggling as the notes bounced through the room. Even the staff joined in, tapping their feet to the rhythm. The girl's laughter, soft and uncertain at first, slowly grew into something real. It was the kind of laughter that comes after too much silence, fragile but full of hope. The man arrived at the center again that evening. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He just needed to see it with his own eyes. As he stood near the doorway, he watched his daughter play a few notes on the piano with the woman guiding her hands. There was a spark of joy on her face that he hadn't seen in months. He listened as Laura encouraged her gently, her voice kind but firm. "You're doing wonderful. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Music doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." Something in those words hit him deeply. He had built his entire life around perfection, around control. But this woman, with her worn shoes and calm voice, understood something far more important: how to heal with imperfection. After the session ended, he finally approached her. She was helping the children put away small instruments when she turned and saw him. "Oh, hello again," she said politely, recognizing him from the other night. "Hi," he replied, his tone quiet but sincere. "I didn't get to thank you properly before. What you did for my daughter, I can't put it into words," Laura smiled gently. "She's a lovely child. She just needed a little music to remind her how to feel again." He nodded, still trying to process how someone so ordinary could carry such extraordinary warmth. "Would you consider working with her more regularly? I could arrange something, maybe private sessions." Laura hesitated. "I'm not really a teacher. I just play a little to help. There are people far more qualified than me." He looked at her, his voice steady but full of quiet urgency. None of them reached her. "You did," her eyes softened. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being needed like that. Not by someone with power or wealth, but by a small, fragile child who simply wanted to hear her music. "I'll think about it," she said finally, not wanting to promise something she couldn't deliver. "Please do," he replied, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. That night, as Laura walked home, her mind was spinning. She didn't know why this mattered so much to her. Maybe because for once someone believed she could make a difference. Maybe because she saw herself in that little girl, someone trying to find light in a world that often felt too dark. The next morning, she woke early again. The city was still quiet, the sky a pale blue. She sat by the window with her cup of coffee, looking at the piano in the corner. It was old and out of tune, but it still had a soul. Just like her. Her son woke up and climbed into her lap, asking about her night. She told him about the children, the laughter, and how the little girl was getting better. He listened with wide eyes, smiling proudly. "See? I told you music can make people happy," he said. She hugged him tightly, her eyes misty. "You're right," she whispered. That evening, she went back to the center again. The staff greeted her warmly now, as if she were part of their little family. She played for the children, taught them small rhythms, and watched their faces light up as they found their own sounds. The little girl was more open this time, even humming along. The man arrived quietly again, standing near the doorway like before. But this time, when the music ended, he didn't just watch. He clapped, a small but genuine smile breaking across his face. Laura looked up, surprised, and smiled back. For a brief second, their eyes met, not as a billionaire and a worker, but as two parents who understood the same truth. Sometimes, love and kindness could do what money never could. As the evening ended, the man spoke to the center's director privately. He wanted Laura to continue helping. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way to make it happen. Meanwhile, Laura walked home with a light heart. She couldn't explain why, but she felt something changing, not just in the little girl, but inside herself. The music she had once buried deep inside was finding its way back, note by note, through the laughter of children and the quiet gratitude of a stranger who had seen what she could do. At home, her son asked her to play before bed, and she did. This time, her melody wasn't just a lullaby, it was a song of hope, of second chances. The notes carried softly through the apartment, filling the night with warmth. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she looked forward to finding out. The following week passed quietly, but something inside Laura had begun to shift. Each evening at the Children's Center left her more inspired than the last. Every time she touched the piano, she felt alive again, as if the music she had buried deep inside was slowly waking up. The little girl had changed too. She now waited by the piano before the sessions even began, her small hands ready to play. Sometimes she laughed when she missed a note. Sometimes she frowned in concentration, but every sound she made was progress, and every note she played made Laura's heart ache in the best possible way. One evening, as the children left with their parents, the director of the center approached Laura with a warm smile. "You have a gift," she said softly. "It's not just your playing. It's how you make people feel when you do it." Laura blushed a little, unused to praise. "I just try to help," she replied. The director nodded. "That's exactly why it works. You care." Laura gathered her bag and coat, and as she was about to leave, she noticed the familiar tall man standing in the hallway again. He wasn't wearing his usual business coat this time. He looked more relaxed, though his expression still carried a quiet sadness. He walked over slowly. "You're leaving already?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said with a polite smile. "I just finished the last session." He hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to thank you once more. My daughter is smiling again. She hums your songs at home. I can't tell you what that means to me." Laura's heart softened. "I'm really glad to hear that. She's a special child." "She is," he said, looking down for a moment. "But I think you're the one who reminded her how to be." His words caught her off guard. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply smiled. "I just play the piano," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, you do more than that." There was a brief silence between them, the kind that feels heavy with things left unsaid. Then he handed her a small card. "If you ever have time, please call. I'd like to talk about something." She took the card and thanked him, not realizing it had his company's name printed on it, a name that most people in the city knew well. That night, after she put her son to bed, Laura sat by the window with the card in her hand. The rain had started again, soft and rhythmic against the glass. She turned the card over a few times, wondering why someone like him, a man who clearly had everything, would want to talk to someone like her. Maybe it was about music. Maybe about his daughter's sessions. Still, she felt nervous at the thought. She had spent most of her life being invisible to people like him. The thought of stepping into his world felt like walking into a different universe. She placed the card on the table and sighed. "I'll think about it," she whispered to herself. The next few days were a blur of work and responsibilities. Between her shifts at the cafe and the therapy sessions, she barely had time to rest. But no matter how tired she always found the energy to play. The sound of the piano had become her own kind of therapy. One afternoon, the director asked if she could stay a little longer. "There's someone who wants to see you," she said. Laura nodded, a little confused. When she walked into the small meeting room, she found the same man waiting for her. He stood when she entered, offering a kind smile. "I hope you don't mind me asking you here," he began. "I didn't want to disturb you at work." "It's all right," she said softly, still unsure what this was about. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please sit." As she did, she noticed how tired he looked, despite his polished suit and calm manner. There was something lonely in his eyes, something that reminded her of herself. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "You've done more for my daughter in a few weeks than anyone else has managed in months. You brought her back to life. I want to thank you properly." "There's no need," Laura replied quickly. "Just seeing her happy again is enough." He smiled faintly. "You're humble. But please let me do something. I was hoping you could work with her privately. At home, maybe twice a week. I'd like to pay you for your time." Laura's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I don't know if I can do that. I already work long hours at the cafe, and I'll make sure it doesn't affect your schedule," he said quickly. "And of course I'll compensate you fairly." She hesitated, looking down at her hands. It sounded like an opportunity, but it also felt overwhelming. She wasn't used to dealing with wealthy people or being offered money like that. "I appreciate it," she said softly. "I just don't want to promise something I can't handle." "I understand," he said gently. "Just think about it." As she left the room, she felt both nervous and curious. There was something about him that made her uneasy, not in a bad way, but because he seemed so different from everyone she knew. Yet there was also kindness in his voice, a sincerity that didn't feel forced. That night, she told her son about the offer as she tucked him into bed. "He wants me to teach his daughter privately," she explained. Her son's eyes lit up. "That's amazing, Mom." "You should do it," she laughed softly. "You think so?" "Yeah, maybe he'll buy you a new piano," he said with a grin. She smiled at his innocence. "I don't think that's how it works, sweetheart." Still, as she sat by her old piano later that night, the thought stayed with her. Maybe this was her chance, not for money, but for something more. A chance to use her gift again, to make a difference, and maybe to rebuild the confidence she had lost long ago. The next day, she called the number on the card. His assistant answered and arranged a meeting for later that week. When the day arrived, she dressed as neatly as she could, wearing a plain blouse and a skirt she'd ironed twice to smooth out the wrinkles. She took the bus across town, watching the city change through the window, from small shops and narrow streets to tall glass buildings that reached for the sky. When she arrived, she stood in awe of the mansion before her. The gates opened automatically, and a long driveway led to a beautiful house surrounded by gardens. Everything about it felt unreal, like stepping into a movie scene. The man greeted her at the door himself, smiling warmly. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please come in." Inside, the house was elegant but not cold. It had warmth, the kind that comes from someone who wants a home, not just a place to live. His daughter ran into the room, smiling brightly when she saw Laura. She hugged her tightly, and the sight made both adults smile. The man led them to a music room with a grand piano that gleamed under the soft light. Laura's breath caught for a moment. She had never seen one so beautiful up close. "Would you like to start here?" he asked. Laura nodded and sat down beside the little girl. She placed her hands gently on the keys, playing a few soft notes to test the sound. The piano responded like silk, rich and warm. The girl giggled at the sound, clapping her hands. For the next hour, the two of them played together while he stood quietly in the corner, listening. He didn't interrupt or speak. He simply watched, his heart swelling with gratitude. When the lesson ended, Laura stood and smiled at the child. "You did wonderfully today," she said warmly. As the girl ran off to show her toys, he turned to Laura. "Thank you. I haven't heard this house filled with music in years." She looked around the room, noticing framed photos of a woman on the wall. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded. She was the one who loved music most. She used to play that same piano every evening. After she passed, I couldn't bear to hear it again. Until now. Laura's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time for music to come back." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it is." When she left that evening, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She felt strangely at peace. For the first time in years, she had played on a piano that sang beautifully, and more than that, she had brought comfort to a family that needed it. As she walked down the quiet street, the world felt softer, brighter. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but something inside told her that everything was about to change. For her, for the little girl, and perhaps even for the man who watched her play in silence. And somewhere deep down, she felt a melody begin to form, one that belonged to all of them. The days that followed were unlike anything the woman had experienced in years. The music room had become her quiet world, a small place where her heart could finally breathe. Every morning she came early to clean the grand piano, straighten the sheets of music, and check the keys as if she were caring for a living soul. She wasn't paid to do that part, but she did it anyway. It felt like a small act of love, one she could still give freely even when life had taken so much. The young girl, once restless and shy, now waited for her by the piano every afternoon. She didn't speak much, but the moment the woman began to play, her eyes softened. Sometimes she would hum along softly, her little voice trembling like the sound of spring water. It was those moments that made the woman forget her tired feet and her unpaid bills. The music wasn't just notes anymore. It was a thread between two hearts trying to heal. But what neither of them knew was that every time the piano came alive, someone was watching from the top floor of the building. Behind large glass windows, a man stood quietly, listening. He was a person who lived in a world made of numbers, schedules, and responsibilities. People around him spoke carefully, always with respect. He had built an empire that touched nearly every corner of the city. Yet in the middle of all that power and noise, he lived in silence, a silence that no one dared to break. When he first heard the piano, he thought it was a recording from his daughter's tutor. But the melody was different, soft, sincere, and full of something he hadn't heard in years. It was the sound of human warmth. The notes didn't just fill the room. They seemed to reach his chest and stir something long buried. That day, he didn't interrupt. He stood behind the curtain unseen, and let the music carry him back to the days when life was simpler, and love was not something he had to buy. The woman never imagined that her quiet playing would draw such attention. She had come to this place as a worker, not as a musician, but fate has a way of revealing what's hidden in ordinary souls. Each time her fingers touched the keys, the room changed. The girl, the father, even the staff passing by the hallway, and all seemed to stop and listen without meaning to. The melody carried something they couldn't name. Maybe sorrow, maybe hope, or maybe both. One evening, when the sun was melting into gold behind the tall buildings, the woman stayed back to finish cleaning. The girl had already left with her nanny, leaving behind a little hair clip on the piano bench. The woman smiled and picked it up, thinking she would return it tomorrow. She sat for a moment alone, letting her fingers trace the keys absent-mindedly. Without realizing it, she began to play a tune her mother once sang to her when life was hard, a song that had no name, only feeling. The melody floated through the open window, gentle as a prayer. Down the hall, a few staff members paused, whispering to each other about how pure it sounded. But at that very moment, the man on the top floor stepped out of his office again, drawn by the same familiar pull. He followed the sound down the stairs quietly, something he never did before. It was as if the music was leading him somewhere he didn't know he needed to go. When he reached the music room door, he stopped. Inside, the woman sat at the piano, eyes closed, lost in a world of her own. Her hands moved gracefully, though her clothes were simple and her shoes old. There was no show, no audience, no expectations, only honesty. The kind of honesty money could never create. For a long moment, he simply watched. In that soft light, he saw not a worker but an artist, someone who played not for fame but for love. When she finally noticed him standing there, she froze, startled, and embarrassed. She quickly stood up, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I was just—" He interrupted gently. Playing beautifully. His voice was calm but distant, as though he was still half lost in the melody. She didn't know what to say, so she bowed her head, ready to apologize again, but he shook his head slightly. "You know," he said, I used to hear music like that only once before when my wife was alive." There was a silence that hung between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. His face, though strong and composed, carried sadness in the corners of his eyes. It wasn't the sadness of someone who had lost money or status, but of someone who had lost a piece of his heart and never found it again. He stepped closer to the piano and touched the keys gently, as if remembering something old. "My daughter doesn't talk much anymore," he said quietly. "Not since her mother passed. But she listens to you. She smiles when you play. That hasn't happened in a long time." The woman felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known that her music had reached so deeply. She wanted to say something kind, something comforting, but words felt small compared to what the moment carried. "I didn't mean to intrude," she finally whispered. "I only wanted to help her feel safe." He nodded slowly. "You did more than that. You reminded us that there's still music left in this house." She didn't know what he meant exactly, but something in his tone made her feel that maybe, for the first time in a long while, she had done something that truly mattered. The next morning, the household was different. The staff whispered about how the master himself had gone down to the music room. No one could remember the last time he had left his office for anything personal. The little girl came running to the piano as soon as she saw the woman, holding the same hair clip in her small hand. "You found it," she said happily. "I thought I lost it forever." The woman smiled warmly. "It was waiting for you right here. Maybe it missed you." The girl laughed, and that laugh was like sunlight after rain. It filled the room with a kind of joy that couldn't be forced. As they began their little music session, the father stood quietly by the door again, unnoticed. This time his expression wasn't sad. He simply watched his daughter smile, her hands clapping along to the rhythm. For a man who had everything, that small sound of laughter was worth more than any fortune. That evening, as the woman prepared to leave, the man called her to his office. She was nervous, thinking she might be in trouble for playing without permission, but when she entered, he gestured for her to sit down. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Would you be willing to stay here as my daughter's music tutor? Officially, I mean. You don't have to do the cleaning anymore." Her eyes widened. She didn't expect this. "Sir, I don't have a degree. I only learned from my mother. I'm not a professional." He smiled faintly. "You're exactly what she needs. You play with heart, not with pride. That's what music is meant to be." Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. She lowered her head, hiding her face behind her hair. Life had been cruel for so long. Every door had been closed, every chance taken away. And now suddenly this man, this stranger, was offering her a new beginning. She whispered, "Thank you. I won't disappoint you." The man nodded. "I believe you won't." As she left his office, she couldn't help but smile. The hallway that once felt cold and distant now seemed warmer. She knew things wouldn't be easy. Life rarely was. But for the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. Not just work, but a purpose. A reason to wake up and play. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, she thought about her own child waiting for her in their small rented room. She imagined the look on their face when she told them she had been offered a new job. A better one. Maybe now they could afford proper meals again. Maybe new shoes for school. The thought made her heart light. And far away in his tall building, the man looked out his window at the same city lights. He didn't know why, but he felt something shift inside him. The house no longer felt like a museum of memories. There was music again. There was hope. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, almost like a promise. Maybe it's time to live again. The first few weeks in her new role felt almost unreal to the woman. Every morning she would walk through the tall iron gates with a small smile on her face, still half afraid someone would stop her and say there had been a mistake. But no one did. The staff now greeted her with quiet respect, and the little girl waited eagerly by the piano each day, her small hands ready to play. The music room had changed too. Fresh flowers now sat near the window, their scent mixing with the faint smell of polished wood. The girl had convinced her father to keep them there, saying the flowers made the music sound happier. The woman didn't know if that was true, but she liked the thought. Each lesson became more than just practice. They played not to master technique, but to feel. Sometimes the girl would get lost in laughter when she hit a wrong note, and other times she would suddenly stop playing, her eyes distant, thinking of her mother. In those moments, the woman never rushed her. She would simply keep playing softly, letting the melody carry the silence until the girl was ready to join again. It was through those quiet moments that trust grew, something no words could have built. The father noticed it too. He often came down in the evenings pretending to check his phone or some work papers while secretly listening. The music had changed the house. The halls didn't feel as empty anymore. The woman's voice, soft and calm, would guide his daughter through melodies, and for the first time in years, laughter returned to the rooms. One day, after a particularly long session, the girl looked up at the woman and said, "When you play, I don't feel sad anymore." The woman smiled, touched by the innocent honesty of the child. "That's the power of music," she said. "It doesn't take away pain, but it helps us carry it." The father, standing at the door unnoticed, heard those words. They struck him deeply. He had spent years trying to bury his pain beneath work and wealth. But this woman, with nothing but a piano and kindness, had said something that explained what he never could. He began to find reasons to pass by the music room more often. Sometimes he'd bring documents and sit quietly in the corner, pretending to read while the gentle sounds filled the air. He found peace there, something rare in his world. And slowly he began to talk more, not just about work, but about life. One afternoon after the lesson ended, he approached her as she was tidying the sheet music. "You've done something remarkable," he said softly. "My daughter smiles again. I wasn't sure I'd ever see that." She lowered her head shyly. "She's a bright child. She just needed someone to listen." He nodded. "And you've given her that." For a brief moment, silence filled the space between them. It wasn't awkward, it was full of meaning, of unspoken gratitude. Then the woman said quietly, "Maybe she reminds me of my own child. That's why I understand her." That caught his attention. He hadn't known she had a child. "You have a son or daughter?" he asked. She smiled gently. "A boy, he's 7. He loves music too, though we can't afford lessons. I teach him at home the little I know." The man thought for a moment. Maybe he could come here someday. "My daughter would love to have a friend to play with." Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected such kindness. "That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly impose." He interrupted. "It's no imposition. You've done so much already. Let me do something small in return." She hesitated, then nodded softly. "Thank you. I'll ask him." He'd be thrilled. That night, as she walked home under the fading light, she felt lighter than she had in years. Her son greeted her at the door with a hug, and when she told him the news, his eyes lit up. "A real piano?" he asked. "Not the broken one at home?" She laughed, holding him close. "A real one. And maybe a new friend, too." A few days later, she brought him along. He clutched her hand tightly as they entered the grand house, his eyes wide in awe. Everything seemed magical to him. The tall ceilings, the polished floors, the shining chandelier. But when they reached the music room, his gaze fixed on the grand piano. He walked toward it slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The little girl watched him curiously. She had never seen another child in the house before. The woman smiled and introduced them, and before long, the two were giggling as they played random notes together, filling the room with bright, clumsy music. The father stood quietly in the doorway again, watching the scene unfold. The sound of children laughing filled him with a warmth he couldn't explain. For the first time, he saw his daughter playing like a child again, carefree, joyful, alive. After that day, the boy often came along whenever his mother had lessons. The two children became inseparable, their friendship growing naturally. They would invent songs, make up stories, and sometimes just sit together listening to the woman play. One afternoon, while the children were drawing by the window, the man asked the woman, "Do you ever perform publicly?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. "No, I used to play in small places years ago, but life changed. Now I just play for my son, and here." "You should play for more people," he said. "Your music has life. People need to hear it." "I don't think anyone would listen," she said softly. "I would," he replied simply. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for a moment. There was something steady and sincere in them, not pity but respect. It made her heart beat a little faster, though she didn't know why. Days turned into weeks, and the house continued to change. The staff smiled more. The father spent less time locked in his office. The woman's music seemed to touch everyone who heard it. Even the walls, once cold and silent, now echoed with melodies of hope. One rainy afternoon, the girl came running into the music room, her hair messy from play. "Papa," she called out, "can we have a concert here? Just a small one? She can play and we'll invite everyone." Her father smiled at her excitement. "A concert? Yes!" "For Mama," the girl said, her eyes shining. "I want her to hear the music from heaven." The man's expression softened. The room went quiet for a second. Then he looked at the woman. "Would you do that? Play something in her memory?" The woman's eyes grew moist. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I would be honored." And so they planned it. A small gathering in the house, just family and close friends. The little girl helped make invitations with her crayons, while the boy collected flowers from the garden. The house buzzed with gentle excitement. When the evening finally came, the room glowed with soft light. The guests gathered quietly, and the woman sat at the piano, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked around. At the children, at the father, at the faces filled with quiet expectation, and then began to play. The first notes were slow, delicate, almost like a whisper. Then the melody grew, blooming into something rich and full. Every sound told a story, and of loss, of hope, of kindness found in unexpected places. Some guests closed their eyes. Others simply watched, moved beyond words. When the final note faded, there was silence. Then softly applause. The little girl ran up to her and hugged her tightly. "Mama heard it," she whispered. "I know she did." The woman smiled through tears. She looked toward the father. He was clapping too, but there was something deeper in his gaze. Something that said thank you, not just for the music, but for bringing his home back to life. Later that night, as the guests left, he found her standing alone near the piano, gently closing the lid. "You played beautifully," he said. She smiled shyly. "It wasn't me. It was the music. It just wanted to be heard." He looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe it was you," he said quietly. "Maybe it was your heart." The rain had stopped outside. The night was still. The children's laughter echoed faintly from the hall. The man and the woman stood there in the soft glow of the chandelier, not as employer and worker, but as two souls who had unknowingly healed each other through the language of music. For her, it was the first time in years that she didn't feel invisible, and for him it was the first time in years that his heart felt whole. As she left that evening, walking home with her son under the moonlight, she looked up and smiled. Life had taken her through storms, but somehow, music had led her here, to a place where kindness still existed, where broken hearts could still find harmony, and in the tall house behind her, the man stood by the window, watching her fade into the distance, the faint sound of the piano still lingering in the air like a promise that the story wasn't over yet. The weeks after the small concert passed like a gentle dream. The house that once echoed with silence was now alive with laughter and melody. The woman continued teaching, and her son and the little girl became almost inseparable. Every morning, the sound of their giggles filled the halls before the first note was even played. The man often stood at his office doorway, listening with a faint smile he didn't even realize he wore. The woman had never imagined that her life would turn like this. She still lived in her small apartment, still counted every coin carefully at the end of the week, but there was a new peace in her heart. She had found a place where her music mattered, where her kindness was seen, and every time she played, she felt she was giving something not only to the girl but to herself. The part that had once been lost in hardship and loneliness. The man's daughter began improving quickly. She could now play small tunes without help, her fingers finding confidence with every session. One afternoon, after finishing a piece, she looked at her father proudly and said, "Papa, when I play, it feels like Mama is listening." Her father knelt beside her and held her close. "She is," he whispered. "She's listening right here." The woman turned her face away, pretending to arrange the sheets. Her eyes filled with quiet tears. The man started to invite the woman and her son to stay for dinner sometimes. At first, she politely refused, feeling it wasn't her place. But after some gentle insisting, mostly from the little girl, she agreed. The first time they sat together, it felt strange but warm. The long dining table, which had always been half empty, finally looked full. The two children sat together, laughing over little jokes while the man and woman exchanged smiles across the table. It wasn't a grand meal, but it felt like a family. One evening after dinner, the man asked her a question he had been holding for weeks. "You've brought music back into this house," he said softly. But I can't help wondering what brought it back into you. You play like someone who's lived a story." The woman looked at her hands resting on the table. Her fingers trembled slightly. "Everyone has a story," she said after a pause. "Mine isn't special, I just learned to survive." He didn't press further. He only said, "Sometimes surviving is the most special story of all." That night she walked home under the quiet sky, her son holding her hand. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was walking away from something, but toward something. As time went on, the man began including her in more family matters. When the girl's birthday came, he asked her to help plan the music. She helped choose songs, taught the children a duet, and even played a small piece herself. The guests were surprised. They expected a simple children's party, but what they witnessed was something beautiful. The woman's playing brought warmth that no decorations could match. Everyone clapped, and the little girl ran to hug her. "You made my birthday perfect," she cried. The man stood behind them, his eyes glistening with pride and gratitude. After the guests left, the woman helped tidy up. The man lingered nearby, watching her quietly. "You know," he said gently, "you've changed this house more than anyone ever could. You've given my daughter something I thought she lost forever." She smiled a little shyly. "I only gave her what I wish someone had given me, and hope." He looked at her, and in that moment no words were needed. The look said everything. Days passed, then months. Seasons changed outside, but inside the house something deeper was growing. Not just friendship or gratitude, but a quiet connection that words couldn't define. The woman never imagined that a man like him, rich, powerful, always surrounded by business, would find comfort in her company. But he did. Often they would share tea after the lessons, talking about simple things, childhood, dreams, the strange way life brings people together. He told her about his late wife, how she had loved music, how she used to play the same piano that now filled their home again. "She wanted our daughter to grow up around music," he said softly one evening, staring at the keys. "After she passed, I couldn't bear to hear it. I thought silence would hurt less, but I was wrong." The woman placed her hand gently on the piano as if feeling its heartbeat. "Silence never heals," she said quietly. "It only hides the pain." He looked at her, and for a long time neither spoke. The music between them said everything. One day an unexpected letter arrived for the woman. It was from an organization that arranged charity events and music workshops for children. They had heard about her through one of the guests from the birthday party. They invited her to play at an upcoming event, a chance to perform in front of hundreds of people. At first she thought it was a mistake. "I'm not a real musician," she said to the man, showing him the letter. "I just play for the children." But he smiled and said, "You are exactly what they need. Someone who plays with heart. That's what makes you real." She hesitated, but eventually agreed. The night of the event, she wore a simple dress, one she had saved for years but never had reason to wear. Her son and the man's daughter sat in the front row, their faces glowing with pride. The man sat behind them, his hands folded, watching silently. When she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounded. The lights were bright, the hall filled with faces she didn't know. For a moment, fear tried to take over. But then she thought of all the moments that led her here. The small room where she practiced alone, the little girl's smile, the boy's laughter, the kindness that found her when she least expected it. And then she began to play. The first note rang clear and warm, followed by another and another, until the entire hall seemed to breathe with her. She played not to impress, but to share, to tell her story without words. The melody spoke of struggle, of love, of the way pain could turn into beauty if given the chance. By the time she finished, the hall was silent. Then slowly, applause rose, filling the air like thunder. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by emotion. After the event, people came to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her how her music touched their hearts. But the only face she searched for was his. When she finally saw him standing near the door with his daughter and her son, she smiled through her tears. He walked toward her and said softly, "You didn't just play tonight. You told the world who you are." She laughed gently, wiping her eyes. "I think I finally remembered." From that night on, everything changed quietly but beautifully. The woman continued to teach at the mansion, but she also began to play at charity events and schools, bringing music to children who had none. The man supported her quietly, arranging instruments and sponsors without her even knowing. It wasn't about money, it was about belief. He believed in her the way no one ever had. One afternoon, as they watched the children play together in the garden, the woman said, "You know, I used to think life only gave me losses, but now I see sometimes it takes everything away just to make room for something new." The man nodded. "And sometimes it sends the right people at the right time, when we least expect them." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the laughter of the children. The woman looked at the man, and he smiled, not as a boss, not as a billionaire, but as someone who had finally found peace. That evening, before leaving, the woman sat at the piano once more. She played softly, a tune that felt like a farewell and a beginning all at once. The man stood nearby, listening. When she finished, he said quietly, "Thank you. For bringing music back, for bringing us back." She turned to him and smiled gently. "Thank you for hearing it." As she walked out into the fading light with her son, she looked back once. The windows of the mansion glowed softly, the same way her heart did. Life had been hard, but it had led her here, to kindness, to connection, to music that healed more than she could ever have imagined. And somewhere behind those windows, the man stood by the piano, his daughter's laughter echoing in the hall. He placed his hand on the keys and whispered, "You were right. Music never truly leaves." Then he pressed one key, a single note that lingered in the air, blending with the memory of her melody, carrying both their stories forward. And from that day on, neither silence nor sorrow ever ruled that house again. There was only music, gentle, honest, alive, reminding everyone who heard it that even in the hardest moments, beauty can still be found.